What happens when an entire community agrees to erase itself from existence rather than face what it's done? Welcome to this journey into the vanished hollows of eastern Kentucky, where we'll uncover a mystery so disturbing that an entire town chose collective amnesia over remembrance. But before we descend into these dark mountains, I need you to ask yourself something. How much evil can good people commit if they believe they're protecting their own? Tell us where you're watching from right now, and whether you think there's ever justification for taking justice into your own hands, because by the end of this account, you may question everything you thought you knew about morality, community, and the terrifying ease with which civilization dissolves when fear takes hold. In the Kentucky State Archives, buried in a box marked only with the year 1936, there exists a collection of photographs that should not exist. 3 images of a town that appears in no modern atlas, no historical survey, no census record after 1937. Buildings, streets, a church with a white steeple, children on a dirt road. And in the final photograph, dated March 12, 1937, a single sentence painted across the doors of every visible structure: God forgive what we became. We're about to delve into the mystery of Stillwater Hollow, a community of roughly 300 souls that flourished for nearly a century in the remote mountains of Breathitt County, only to vanish completely within a span of 18 months. What caused an entire town to abandon everything, scatter to the winds, and collectively agree never to speak its name again? The answer involves a punishment so medieval, so unthinkable, that it shattered not just one life, but the very foundation of communal identity. This isn't just a story about the past. This is a question about how quickly we can become what we fear most. It was the year 1935. The Great Depression had strangled America for 6 brutal years. In the mountains of eastern Kentucky, unemployment wasn't measured in percentages, it was absolute. Coal mines had shuttered. Timber operations had ceased. Survival had become the only industry, and desperation had fermented into something thick and poisonous in the hollow air. But in Stillwater Hollow, nestled so deep in the mountains that even the government forgot it existed, desperation was about to transform into collective madness, a descent so complete that the only way the community could survive was to destroy itself and start over, nameless and scattered, carrying a secret that would haunt bloodlines for generations. Because what happened in Stillwater Hollow in the winter of 1936 wasn't murder. It wasn't even vigilante justice in the traditional sense. It was something far older, something that reached back through centuries of mountain tradition to a form of punishment that civilization had supposedly left behind. And when it was over, when they finally understood what they'd become, the people of Stillwater Hollow made a choice that might be even more disturbing than the act itself. They decided to forget. To understand what happened, you first need to understand the place itself. Geography isn't just setting in this story. It's cause, catalyst, and conspirator. Stillwater Hollow sat in a cleft between 2 mountains that the Cherokee had called the brothers who guard secrets. The hollow ran north, south for approximately 3 miles, never more than half a mile wide at its broadest point. A creek, Stillwater Creek, slow, moving and dark as coffee, bisected the settlement, its water stained brown by tannins from the endless canopy of oak and hickory that choked out the sun even at high noon. The light there was always wrong, filtered through layers of leaves, diffused by constant mist that rose from the creek and clung to everything like cold breath. The illumination in Stillwater Hollow had a greenish, aquarium quality that made people look ill even when they were healthy. Photographers who visited in the 1920s reported that their film often came out underexposed. as if the hollow itself resisted documentation. But it was the sound, or rather, the absence of sound, that visitors remembered most. The hollow was an acoustic dead zone. Words seemed to fall flat, absorbed by the dense foliage and the peculiar geology of the surrounding cliffs. Even the creek, despite its constant flow, produced barely a whisper. Children learned early to raise their voices to be heard across the street. The silence had weight, presence, intelligence. It listened. Approximately 300 people lived in Stillwater Hollow in 1935, though no census taker had made the journey there since 1920. The population was entirely white, descendants of Irish settlers who'd arrived in the late 1700s and simply never left. Intermarriage was common, not just accepted but inevitable in such isolation. By the 20th century, there were only 8 family names in the entire settlement: Coulter, Hensley, Whittaker, Napier, Bowman, Strong, Combs, and Mullins. The town itself consisted of a single dirt road that ran parallel to the creek. Roughly 40 structures lined this road, homes built from hand, hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, a general store run by the Hensley family, a one-room schoolhouse, and the First Baptist Church of Stillwater, a white clapboard building with a bell tower that dominated the landscape like a judgmental finger pointing skyward. There was no electricity. No telephone lines reached into the hollow. The nearest town with actual infrastructure, Jackson, the county seat, lay 23 miles away over mountain roads that became impassable for weeks at a time during winter. Mail delivery was sporadic at best. The outside world was a rumor, and Stillwater Hollow preferred it that way. But here's what you need to understand about isolation. It doesn't just separate you from the world. It changes you. Time moves differently when you're cut off. Old ways persist. Ancient rules, the kind that civilization spent centuries trying to erase, they survive in places like Stillwater Hollow. They wait. They whisper through generations, passed down not in books, but in knowing glances and half-finished sentences that children absorb like second languages. And in Stillwater Hollow, one particular tradition had survived with unusual strength. A tradition concerning justice, punishment, and what the community called the old remedy. We'll return to what that means soon. First, you need to meet the man whose fate would seal the town's doom. His name was Thomas Brennan, and he arrived in Stillwater Hollow on a wet October afternoon in 1934, carrying everything he owned in a canvas rucksack and wearing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was 38 years old, lean as winter, with dark hair beginning to gray at the temples and hands that showed evidence of hard labor, calluses, scars, the permanent dirt under the fingernails. That marks a man who works with the earth. He spoke with an accent that wasn't quite local, a softness to his vowels that suggested education, maybe even time spent in cities. This alone made him suspect in Stillwater Hollow, where strangers were rare and outsiders were viewed with the same wariness one might reserve for a snake found in the woodpile. But Thomas Brennan had 2 things working in his favor. He claimed distant kinship to the Napier family through his mother's line, and he was willing to work for almost nothing. In the autumn of 1934, with starvation a real possibility for many families, a strong back and a willingness to labor for food and shelter was qualification enough. The Napier family, specifically the family patriarch Ezekiel Napier, a man of 72 who ruled his clan with biblical severity, agreed to let Brennan stay in a small cabin on their property in exchange for work clearing land and repairing structures damaged by the previous winter's brutal ice storms. For the first several months, Thomas Brennan kept to himself. He worked dawn to dusk, spoke little, attended church services every Sunday where he sat in the back, and sang hymns in a surprisingly beautiful tenor voice. The few interactions he had with townspeople were polite, deferential even. He showed proper respect to elders. He never cursed or drank corn liquor, both rare qualities in a place where moonshine was more common than clean water. But people noticed things, small things that accumulated like sediment in still water. He watched, not in an obvious way, but with a quiet intensity that made people uncomfortable. Women especially noted how his gaze would linger just a moment too long, though he never said or did anything inappropriate. Children seemed to sense something off about him. They didn't play near the Napier cabin, though they couldn't articulate why. And there was the matter of his past. When asked directly about where he'd come from, what he'd done before arriving in Stillwater Hollow, Brennan's answers were vague, contradictory. Sometimes he claimed to have worked in coal mines in Virginia. Other times he mentioned timber operations in West Virginia. Once he let slip that he'd spent time in Frankfort, the state capital, doing work he wouldn't specify. In a community as small and interconnected as Stillwater Hollow, where everyone's history was common knowledge going back generations, this opacity was more than suspicious. It was threatening. Secrets meant shame. Shame meant danger. But the real concern, the fear that began to spread like frost across glass, started in late January of 1935, when Martha Coulter's daughter disappeared. Rebecca Coulter was 14 years old, blonde, haired and blue-eyed, with a sharp mind that her teacher, Miss Sarah Hensley, said was wasted in a hollow with no future. Rebecca had dreams impractical, impossible dreams of leaving Stillwater, of seeing cities and oceans and electric lights. She kept a journal filled with drawings of places she'd never been but had read about in the few books that circulated through the settlement. On January 23, 1935, a Thursday, Rebecca left her family's cabin around 3 in the afternoon to collect eggs from the chicken coop behind the house. The temperature was dropping rapidly. A winter storm was coming in from the northwest, the kind that could dump 2 feet of snow and trap the hollow under white silence for weeks. She never returned. When Martha Coulter went looking for her daughter an hour later, she found the egg basket overturned near the coop, eggs smashed and already half frozen. But no sign of Rebecca, no tracks in the hardening snow, no torn clothing, no blood, nothing. The search began immediately. Every able-bodied person in Stillwater Hollow turned out, spreading across the hollow and up into the surrounding mountains, calling Rebecca's name until their voices went hoarse. The church bell rang continuously, the signal for emergency, for crisis, for fear made manifest. For 3 days they searched. They dragged the creek despite the ice forming on its surface. They checked every cave, every abandoned mine shaft, every hunting blind and shelter within 5 miles. Hunting dogs lost her scent within 50 yards of the Coulter cabin, as if Rebecca had simply ceased to exist. On the 4th day, the storm hit. 2 feet of snow in 24 hours, drifts piling up to the eaves of cabins, the hollow buried under white that was somehow darker than darkness. The search stopped. It had to. The living had to survive. Rebecca's body was found 6 weeks later, on March 8, 1935, by 2 men hunting turkey in the woods north of the settlement. She was 3 miles from her home, in a shallow ravine that the snow had concealed. The official cause of death, as recorded by the county coroner who made the journey into the hollow when the roads finally cleared in April, was exposure. But that official cause didn't explain certain facts that the coroner noted in his private journal, a journal that would be discovered decades later and would provide crucial insight into what really happened. Rebecca Coulter's body showed signs of having been moved after death. lividity patterns the way blood settles in a corpse, were inconsistent with the position in which she was found. More disturbing, her fingernails contained traces of wood splinters, and her knuckles were abraded in a way consistent with having clawed at something repeatedly, desperately. The coroner, a man named Dr. Silas Morton, who'd seen his share of mountain deaths, wrote in his journal, "The girl didn't die where she was found. She was placed there. And before she died, she was imprisoned somewhere enclosed. Somewhere wooden. The terror she must have experienced defies articulation. I am filing exposure as cause of death because I cannot prove murder, and because this community is already suffering. But I know what I saw. God help whoever did this." Dr. Morton shared his concerns with the community leaders, specifically with Ezekiel Napier and the Baptist Church's minister, Reverend Josiah Whittaker. Their response was to ask him to keep his suspicions private, for the sake of the community, for the sake of preventing panic. Dr. Morton agreed. He left Stillwater Hollow and never returned. But the community had its own suspicions, and those suspicions centered on the stranger who'd arrived just months before Rebecca disappeared. There was no evidence, let's be absolutely clear about that. No physical evidence connected Thomas Brennan to Rebecca Coulter's death. No witnesses placed him near the Coulter cabin that day. No confession, nothing. What there was instead: fear, suspicion, and the terrible mathematics of coincidence in a community small enough that patterns form quickly. Brennan had been seen walking in the woods north of the settlement, the same woods where Rebecca's body was found, on multiple occasions. He'd been seen watching children, including Rebecca, though always from a distance. And there was testimony, later, from several women that Brennan had made them uncomfortable in ways they couldn't quite articulate. But more damning than any of this was what came next. In April of 1935, just weeks after Rebecca's body was discovered, another girl went missing. Emma Hensley, age 16, daughter of the family that ran the general store. She vanished on her way home from church on a Sunday evening. Unlike Rebecca, Emma was found quickly, unconscious in a corn crib on the edge of the settlement, hypothermic but alive. When she regained consciousness 2 days later, Emma's account was confused, fragmentary. She remembered walking home. She remembered hearing footsteps behind her. She remembered a hand over her mouth, a cloth that smelled strange, sweet and chemical, and then nothing until she woke in the corn crib, frozen and terrified. Emma couldn't identify her attacker. She never saw his face, but she remembered his smell to tobacco and wood smoke and something else, something medicinal that she couldn't place. Thomas Brennan smoked tobacco. Thomas Brennan's cabin always smelled of wood smoke. And when the community leaders searched his cabin without warrant, without legal authority, but with complete conviction that they had the right, they found a small bottle of chloroform hidden beneath the floorboards. Brennan claimed he'd found the bottle in the woods. He claimed he'd kept it because he didn't know what it was and thought it might be valuable. He claimed he'd never used it, never would use it, knew nothing about either girl's disappearance. No one believed him. But here's where the story takes its first truly dark turn, because what happened next had nothing to do with law, nothing to do with evidence or courts or the civilized processes that were supposed to govern even remote communities in 20th century America. The people of Stillwater Hollow had their own justice, their own remedy, their own way of dealing with threats to the community. And on April 27, 1935, the elders of Stillwater Hollow convened a council to discuss what should be done about Thomas Brennan. The council met in the back room of the general store, behind closed doors, with guards posted to ensure privacy. 9 men attended: Ezekiel Napier, Reverend Josiah Whittaker, and 7 other family patriarchs representing the major clans of Stillwater Hollow. No minutes were kept. No official record exists of what was discussed, but 3 participants would later, in the years after the town dissolved, speak about what happened in that room. Their accounts vary in details but align on the essential facts. The question before the council was simple: what should be done with Thomas Brennan? The options discussed were equally simple. They could turn him over to authorities in Jackson, the county seat. They could drive him from the hollow and warn him never to return. Or they could invoke what Reverend Whittaker called the old remedy, a form of punishment that had been used in Stillwater Hollow only twice before in living memory, both times in the previous century. The old remedy had a name. They called it the breathing grave. The practice dated back to the earliest days of mountain settlement, borrowed and adapted from European traditions that traced their lineage back to medieval times. In its purest form, it was meant for the worst transgressors, those whose crimes were so heinous that simple death was considered insufficient punishment, those who needed to contemplate their sins in absolute darkness before facing God's judgment. Here's how it worked. The condemned would be placed in a wooden coffin, like box, roughly 7 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 3 feet deep. The box would have small holes drilled in it, enough to allow air circulation, but too small to permit light or hope. The box would then be lowered into a pit approximately 6 feet deep and covered with earth, leaving only a small pipe extending to the surface to ensure continued air supply. The condemned would be left there, conscious, aware, buried alive but breathing. For a predetermined period, typically 3 to 7 days, they would remain in absolute darkness, absolute silence, absolute isolation, with nothing but their thoughts and their sins and the crushing weight of earth pressing down on all sides of their wooden prison. The theory, and make no mistake, the people who practiced this believed deeply in its theoretical and spiritual justification, was that such extreme sensory deprivation, such complete helplessness, would break down the soul's defenses and force genuine repentance. If the condemned survived the ordeal and confessed their sins truthfully, they would be freed and allowed to remain in the community under perpetual watch. If they died well, judgment had been rendered by God Himself. In practice, of course, what the breathing grave actually did was drive people insane. The psychological torture of being buried alive, even with the knowledge that air was being supplied, even with the promise of eventual release, broke the human mind in ways that couldn't be repaired. But in Stillwater Hollow in 1935, with 2 young girls threatened or dead, with fear spreading through the community like cholera through bad water, with a stranger in their midst, who they were convinced was a predator, the old remedy seemed not just justified but necessary. The vote, according to later testimony, was not unanimous. 2 of the 9 council members argued against it. They argued for turning Brennan over to legal authorities. They argued that the old ways were no longer acceptable, that civilization had advanced beyond such barbarism, that Christian mercy demanded better. But 7 men voted in favor. 7 men decided that Thomas Brennan would be placed in the breathing grave for 7 days, 1 day for each year of Rebecca Coulter's life that she would never live. Reverend Whittaker, who cast one of the 7 affirmative votes, would later write in his personal Bible, discovered after his death in 1956, "We believed we were protecting innocence. We believed we were instruments of divine justice. We believed our cause was righteous. May God forgive us for what our belief made us become." The decision was made on April 27th. The punishment would be carried out on May 1st, May Day, a date chosen for its ancient associations with judgment and reckoning. Thomas Brennan was not informed of the council's decision. He was not given a chance to defend himself, to present evidence, to appeal to any higher authority. The council's word was law in Stillwater Hollow. It always had been. But 3 days before May 1st, something happened that should have changed everything. Something that revealed the terrible possibility that the council might be wrong. On April 29, 1935, a man named Jacob Combs walked into the general store just before closing and asked to speak with the council members privately. Jacob Combs was 42 years old, married with 6 children, a respected member of the community who'd lived his entire life in Stillwater Hollow. He was a quiet man, deeply religious, known for his skill with woodworking and his tendency toward melancholy. His wife, Sarah, would later say that he'd been acting strangely for months drawn, sleepless, muttering to himself. What Jacob Combs told the hastily assembled council members that evening was this: he was responsible for Rebecca Coulter's death. Not intentionally, he insisted, not through malice, but through negligence so profound it amounted to the same thing. His story: he'd been checking his hunting blind in the woods north of the settlement on the afternoon Rebecca disappeared. He'd built a small shelter there, barely more than a wooden box with a hinged lid, where he could wait for deer. Rebecca, wandering further than she should have, had somehow discovered the blind and climbed inside to investigate. The lid had fallen shut. It had a tendency to stick, trapping her inside. Jacob Combs hadn't checked the blind again for weeks. By the time he discovered Rebecca's body, she'd been dead for days. Panicked, convinced he'd be blamed, he'd moved her body to the ravine where it was eventually found. The story was plausible. It explained the wood splinters under Rebecca's fingernails. It explained the lividity patterns that Dr. Morton had noted. It even explained why the girl had been moved. But it didn't explain Emma Hensley's attack. It didn't explain the chloroform. And significantly, several council members immediately noted inconsistencies in Combs' account, details that didn't quite align with the timeline, with the weather, with known facts. Under questioning, Jacob Combs became increasingly confused, contradicting himself, changing details. Within an hour, it became clear that his confession was either fabricated or the product of a mind deteriorating under stress. Why would a man falsely confess to causing a child's death? Ezekiel Napier, in testimony given years later to a researcher studying the dissolution of Stillwater Hollow, said he believed Jacob Combs was trying to save Thomas Brennan because he knew the stranger was innocent. He believed Combs' conscience, awakened by the council's decision to use the breathing grave, compelled him to sacrifice himself to prevent what he saw as murder. Other council members believed Combs was mentally ill, driven mad by the same isolation and desperation that gripped the entire community. But regardless of motive, the council had to make a decision. Did this confession change anything? They took another vote. This time, the decision was 8-1 in favor of proceeding with Brennan's punishment as planned. The reasoning: even if Combs was somehow involved with Rebecca's death, Brennan remained the most likely suspect in Emma Hensley's attack. The chloroform, the suspicious behavior, the pattern, the one dissenting vote came from Samuel Hensley, Emma's own father. He would later say he voted against the breathing grave not because he believed Brennan was innocent, but because he feared what the act would do to the community's soul. He was right to fear. Jacob Combs left the general store that evening and walked into the woods. His body was found 3 days later, hanging from a sycamore tree near Stillwater Creek. He left no note, but in his pocket, searchers found a small wooden carving of a girl with blonde hair, a child's toy he'd been making for one of his daughters. His death should have served as a warning. It should have made the council reconsider. It should have suggested that something was terribly wrong with their certainty, their righteousness, their conviction that they were serving justice. It didn't. On the morning of May 1st, 1935, as dawn broke over Stillwater Hollow with a slow, grudging light that never fully penetrated the canopy, 23 men gathered in the clearing north of the settlement where the breathing grave had been prepared, and Thomas Brennan, who'd spent the previous 3 days locked in the church cellar, was brought forward to face his punishment. They came for him just after sunrise. 6 men, moving with the grim efficiency of pallbearers, their faces set in expressions that revealed nothing, not anger, not satisfaction, not even the uncertainty that some of them must have felt. Thomas Brennan had not been told what was coming. He'd been held in the church cellar since April 28th, given food and water but no information, no chance to speak in his own defense. When the cellar door opened and he saw the delegation waiting for him, he must have known. The way men's faces change when they've decided you're already dead, he must have recognized that transformation. "What's happening?" he asked. According to witnesses, his voice was steady, not defiant, but not broken either. Just resigned, perhaps, as if some part of him had always known it would end this way. "You're going to have a chance to confess," Reverend Whittaker said. "A chance to face what you've done and make peace with God." They bound his hands, not tightly enough to cause pain, but securely enough to eliminate any possibility of resistance. Thomas Brennan didn't resist anyway. What would have been the point? 23 men surrounded him. The entire community had gathered to watch. Women held children back. Men formed a perimeter. This was happening with or without his cooperation. The walk to the clearing took 15 minutes. Through the settlement, past cabins where people watched from windows with expressions ranging from righteous satisfaction to barely concealed horror. Past the church where Brennan had sung hymns in that beautiful tenor voice. Past the schoolhouse where Rebecca Coulter had learned to read. Past the general store where Jacob Combs had delivered his worthless confession. The path into the woods was narrow, overgrown, little more than a game trail that climbed steadily upward through dense laurel and rhododendron. The morning air was thick with moisture, almost liquid, and the sound of footsteps on dead leaves created a rhythm, a terrible heartbeat that marked time until the inevitable. The clearing, when they reached it, was small, perhaps 20 feet in diameter, ringed by ancient oaks whose branches interlaced overhead to create a natural cathedral. And in the center of that clearing lay the breathing grave. The pit was precisely 6 feet deep, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long. It had taken 3 days to dig through the rocky soil, working in shifts, using picks and shovels, and the sheer determination that comes from collective conviction. The dirt removed from the pit was piled nearby in a neat mound that seemed obscenely organized given what it would soon cover. Next to the pit lay the box. It had been built by Samuel Hensley, who was known as the finest carpenter in Stillwater Hollow. The irony that a man who'd voted against this punishment had been the one to construct its instrument was not lost on anyone. But Hensley had explained that he built the box precisely because he opposed its use. If this sin was going to be committed, at least the craftsmanship would be sound enough to ensure Brennan survived the ordeal. The box was 7 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 3 feet deep, constructed from pine planks 2 inches thick and reinforced with iron brackets at the corners. Holes had been drilled in a grid pattern across the top, and sides roughly 1/4 inch in diameter, spaced 6 inches apart. Enough to allow air circulation, not enough to admit light once the box was buried. A single 3-inch diameter pipe, 8 feet long, lay beside the box. This would be inserted through a larger hole in the lid, extending up through the earth to the surface, ensuring continuous airflow even under 6 feet of soil. Thomas Brennan looked at the box, looked at the pit, looked at the men surrounding him. "I didn't do it," he said. His voice remained steady, but something in his eyes had changed. A recognition that truth didn't matter anymore, had perhaps never mattered. "I swear before God, I didn't hurt those girls. I don't know who did, but it wasn't me." "Then you'll survive this," Ezekiel Napier said. 7 days. If you're innocent as you claim, God will preserve you. And if you're guilty, then may He have mercy on your soul, because we have none left to give. They placed him in the box. This is where the accounts become difficult to reconcile, where multiple witnesses remember the same events differently, filtered through guilt and horror and the mind's desperate need to rewrite. What cannot be borne? Some witnesses said Thomas Brennan went quietly, resigned to his fate. Others said he fought, that it took 4 men to force him into the box, that his screams echoed off the surrounding mountains like the cries of something inhuman. But all accounts agree on what happened once he was inside. The lid was fitted into place, secured with iron brackets that bolted to the sides of the box. The air pipe was inserted through its designated hole, and then the box was lowered using ropes and pulleys secured to the surrounding oaks, into the pit. The sound of wood scraping against earth, the terrible finality of that descent, and then the burial began. 3 men, working in rotation, using shovels to fill the pit, dirt falling onto wood, each shovelful a decision, a confirmation, an acceptance of what they were doing. The sound was absolute, mathematical, inevitable. First the box disappeared under a layer of loose earth. Then the earth was tamped down, compressed, made solid. Then more earth, more tamping. Layer by layer until the pit was filled, until the ground was level, until the only evidence of what lay beneath was the iron pipe extending 3 feet above the surface, a breathing tube that might as well have been a gravestone. The entire process took approximately 40 minutes. And when it was finished, when the last shovelful had been placed and the earth had been stamped flat by boots that had carried men to church just days before, the 3 men stood in a circle around the filled pit and listened. They could hear him. Through the pipe, filtered and distant but unmistakable, they could hear Thomas Brennan breathing. Rapid, shallow breaths, the sound of a man trying not to panic, trying to conserve air, trying to survive. Reverend Whittaker led a prayer. He asked God to judge Thomas Brennan justly. He asked for protection for the community. He asked for peace, but even as he prayed, even as 3 men bowed their heads and murmured amen, they could hear the breathing. In and out, the sound of a man buried alive, conscious, aware, experiencing a terror so complete that the human mind has no framework for processing it. 7 days. Ezekiel Napier said when the prayer was finished, "We'll return on May 8th. If he confesses, if he tells us the truth, he'll be freed." A guard schedule was established. 2 men would remain at the clearing at all times, in rotating shifts, to ensure the breathing pipe wasn't blocked, to ensure no one attempted to free Brennan, to ensure the punishment proceeded as intended. The rest of the men returned to the settlement, returned to their homes and their families, returned to their lives, if such return was possible for men who'd just buried another man alive. That was May 1st, 1935. The 7 days that followed would destroy Stillwater Hollow more completely than any fire, any flood, any natural disaster could have managed. Because what happened in that clearing wasn't just punishment. It was transformation. It was the moment when a community crossed a line from which there could be no return. Day 1, May 1st to May 2nd, 1935. The first shift of guards, Marcus Bowman and William Strong, both in their early 30s, both fathers, both men who'd lived their entire lives in Stillwater Hollow, reported that Thomas Brennan remained conscious and breathing steadily throughout the day and into the night. They said he didn't scream. They said he didn't beg. For the first several hours, he didn't make any sound at all except for breathing. But as darkness fell, as the temperature dropped, and the absolute isolation of his situation became inescapable, he began to talk. Not to the guards specifically, more like to himself, to God, to the darkness. He recited Bible verses, long passages from the book of Job, from Psalms, from Lamentations. The guards, listening through the pipe, said his voice never wavered, never broke, just continued in a steady monotone that was somehow more disturbing than screaming would have been. "He's praying," Marcus Bowman told the next shift when they arrived at dawn on May 2nd. "He hasn't stopped praying all night." Day 2, May 2nd to May 3rd. By the second day, Thomas Brennan's voice had changed. The steady recitation of Scripture had given way to fragments, incomplete thoughts, moments of silence punctuated by sudden outbursts that made the guards flinch. He wasn't begging for release. He was talking to people who weren't there. His mother, who'd apparently died when he was young. A woman named Catherine, who might have been a wife or lover. Someone named Michael, who he kept apologizing to for something unspecified. The guards on the second shift, brothers named Joseph and Daniel Napier, reported that around midday, Brennan began laughing. Not hysterical laughter, but genuine amusement, as if he'd suddenly understood some cosmic joke. The laughter continued for approximately an hour, then stopped abruptly. In the settlement, the mood was darkening. The reality of what they'd done was beginning to penetrate. Women who'd supported the punishment now avoided looking at their husbands. Children asked questions that couldn't be answered. Why was Mr. Brennan in the ground? Was he going to die? Why didn't they just put him in jail? Reverend Whittaker held a special service on the evening of May 2nd. He preached about justice, about righteousness, about the community's responsibility to protect innocence. But his sermon felt hollow, performative, and several families left halfway through. Sarah Combs, widow of Jacob Combs, stood during the service and spoke words that would haunt the congregation. "My husband killed himself because he knew you were about to murder an innocent man. When you dig Thomas Brennan up, dead or alive, his blood is on all our hands." She walked out. She was never seen in Stillwater Hollow again. Day 3, May 3rd to May 4th. The silence began on the third day. According to the guards, Thomas Whittaker and Samuel Hensley, the very men who'd argued most strenuously against the breathing grave, Thomas Brennan stopped making any sound at all around mid-day on May 3rd. At first, they thought he might have died. But when they listened carefully at the pipe, they could still hear breathing. Slower now, shallow, but present. "He's given up," Thomas Whittaker said. "He knows we're not coming for him." But Samuel Hensley disagreed. "He hasn't given up," he said. "He's gone somewhere else, somewhere in his mind where we can't reach him." They were both wrong. Around midnight on May 3rd, Brennan began singing. Not hymns this time, not prayers, a lullaby, the kind a mother sings to a child. The same verse, over and over, in a voice that had lost all resemblance to the tenor that had once filled the church. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Mama's gonna buy you a mockingbird, and if that mockingbird don't sing, Mama's gonna buy you a diamond ring." For hours. The same verse, the same melody, broken occasionally by sobs that sounded like they were being torn from somewhere deep in his chest. Samuel Hensley, listening to this, began to weep. He told Thomas Whittaker they should stop this, should dig Brennan up now, should end it before it went any further. Whittaker agreed, but when they returned to the settlement to demand the council reconvene, veen, and reconsider, they were met with resistance that had hardened into something immovable. 7 days, Ezekiel Napier said, "We committed to 7 days. If we stop now, we admit we were wrong to start, and we weren't wrong. He hurt those girls, we all know it. We don't know it." Hensley argued, "We suspect it, we fear it, but we don't know it. Then let God judge." Napier replied, 7 days, day 4, May 4th to May 5th. By the 4th day, the entire community was fracturing. Families that had lived side by side for generations stopped speaking. Arguments erupted over meals, in shops, on the street. Some people insisted they had to see the punishment through, that stopping now would mean Jacob Combs had died for nothing, that Emma Hensley's attacker would go unpunished, that weakness would invite more predators into their midst. Others, a growing number, believed they'd made a terrible mistake, that the breathing grave was barbaric regardless of Brennan's guilt or innocence, that civilization meant resisting our worst impulses even when we were afraid, but no one was willing to take action. No one was willing to go to the clearing, overpower the guards, and dig Brennan up, because doing so would mean standing against the community, against the elders, against the collective decision that everyone had at least tacitly supported by not stopping it. In the breathing grave, Thomas Brennan had stopped singing. He'd stopped making any voluntary sound. But the guards reported hearing something else, a wet, rasping quality to his breathing that suggested his lungs were filling with fluid. Pneumonia, probably. The dampness of the earth seeping through the box, the cold, the stress his body was beginning to fail. Martha Coulter, Rebecca's mother, visited the clearing on the afternoon of May 4th. She wanted to see the place, wanted to hear the man who'd killed her daughter struggling to breathe underground. But when she arrived and listened at the pipe, when she heard that terrible wet rasping, something broke inside her. "Dig him up," she said to the guards. "Dig him up now. Mrs. Coulter, we can't. Dig him up," she screamed. "I don't care what he did. Nobody deserves this, not even him." The guards refused. They had their orders. 7 days. Martha Coulter collapsed, sobbing, on the ground above the breathing grave. She stayed there for 3 hours, crying and praying and begging God to either save Thomas Brennan or take him quickly so his suffering would end. When she finally returned to the settlement, she was a different person, hollowed out, empty. She would live another 23 years, but according to her remaining family, she never smiled again. Day 5, May 5th to May 6th. The breathing stopped being regular on the 5th day. Long periods of silence, then sudden gasping. The guards couldn't tell if Brennan was sleeping, unconscious, or simply too weak to maintain steady respiration. Around noon, he spoke for the first time in more than 24 hours. "I forgive you." 3 words, barely audible, but clear enough that both guards heard them. "I forgive you." Then silence again. In the settlement, Reverend Whittaker was struggling with his own crisis of faith. He'd supported the breathing grave because he genuinely believed it was just, believed it was necessary, believed it served a higher purpose. But by the 5th day, listening to reports from the guards, seeing the community tearing itself apart, he began to doubt. He went to the clearing alone that evening, after the guards had rotated out. He knelt beside the breathing pipe. He listened, nothing, just silence, the terrible possibility that Brennan was already dead, that they'd killed him, that it had all been for nothing. Reverend Whittaker prayed. He asked God for a sign. He asked for guidance. He asked to know if they'd done the right thing. And from the pipe, barely audible, came a whisper. "Why?" Just one word, but it contained everything. Every question, every accusation, every indictment of what they'd become. Reverend Whittaker had no answer. Day 6. May 6th to May 7th. By the 6th day, approximately half the community wanted to end the punishment immediately. Petitions were circulating. Arguments had escalated to physical confrontations. The settlement was fracturing along family lines, Coulters and Hensleys demanding mercy, Napiers and Bowmans insisting on seeing it through. But Ezekiel Napier, who'd led the council that imposed the sentence, remained unmovable. "One more day," he said. "We've come this far. One more day, and then it's over." What he didn't say, what he couldn't say, was that stopping now would mean admitting the entire endeavor had been wrong from the start. And Ezekiel Napier was not a man who admitted error. In the breathing grave, Thomas Brennan was dying. The guards reported no sounds at all except for occasional wet, rattling breaths that came irregularly, sometimes minutes apart. Emma Hensley, the girl who'd survived the attack, visited the clearing on the afternoon of May 6th. She was still recovering, still traumatized, but she insisted on seeing the place where her alleged attacker was buried. She listened at the pipe for several minutes. Then she turned to her father, Samuel Hensley, who'd accompanied her. "I don't think it was him," she said quietly. "What? The man who grabbed me? I've been thinking about it, remembering. The smell was wrong. The size was wrong. I don't think it was Mr. Brennan." Samuel Hensley's face went pale. "Emma, you can't. Why didn't you say something before?" "I wasn't sure. I'm still not sure. But Daddy, what if we're killing the wrong man?" That question, "What if we're killing the wrong man?" spread through the settlement like a virus. By evening on May 6th, even some of the strongest supporters of the breathing grave were having doubts. An emergency council meeting was called. The 9 elders gathered once again in the back room of the general store. The debate raged for hours. Finally, at 2 in the morning on May 7th, a decision was reached. They would dig him up at dawn. 7 days was close enough. The punishment had been severe enough to serve its purpose, whether Brennan was guilty or not. And if he died before they could free him, his blood would be on all their hands. The vote was unanimous. But they were already too late. Day 7, May 7th to May 8th. When the delegation arrived at the clearing at dawn on May 7th, 20 men this time, bringing shovels and ropes and medical supplies in the desperate hope that Brennan might still be saved, found something wrong. The breathing pipe had been removed, not broken, not collapsed, removed, pulled straight out of the ground and lying on its side several feet away from the filled pit. And when they listened at the hole left by the pipe, they heard nothing, no breathing, no movement, no sound at all. They dug frantically. 20 men working in shifts, shoveling earth that had been so carefully placed just 6 days before. It took nearly 2 hours to uncover the box. The lid was still sealed. The iron brackets were still in place. But when they unbolted them, when they lifted the lid and looked inside, they found Thomas Brennan. He was dead. His body was curled in a fetal position, hands clawed, mouth open in what must have been a final scream. His fingernails had torn grooves in the wooden walls. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. The cause of death was later determined to be suffocation. The breathing pipe, the only thing keeping him alive, had been deliberately removed sometime during the night of May 6th. Without it, he'd had perhaps 30 minutes of breathable air before the carbon dioxide he exhaled filled the box and poisoned him. But here's what made it murder rather than just a horrific punishment that went too far. Someone had removed that pipe. Someone had pulled it out and laid it aside. Someone had decided that Thomas Brennan needed to die. The investigation into who removed the pipe lasted exactly 3 days before the council decided to abandon it. Too many people had access to the clearing. Too many people had motive both for mercy and for malice. Too many people wanted Brennan dead, and too many people wanted his death to be quick rather than prolonged. In the end, no one was charged, no one was punished. The official cause of death was recorded as exposure and respiratory failure, technically true, deliberately incomplete. But everyone in Stillwater Hollow knew the truth. They'd buried a man alive, and when conscience had finally penetrated their certainty, someone had decided to finish what the community had started. They'd committed murder, all of them, some through action, most through complicity, all through the silence that had allowed it to happen. And that realization destroyed them. Thomas Brennan was buried in an unmarked grave on the outskirts of the settlement on May 9, 1935. No service was held, no prayers were said, just a hole in the ground and a body placed in it with the same efficiency that had once characterized all community endeavors. But something fundamental had broken in Stillwater Hollow. Within 2 weeks, the first families began leaving. The Coulters, the Hensleys, the Whitakers, families that had lived in the hollow for generations, packed what they could carry and simply left, heading for Jackson, for Lexington, for anywhere that wasn't contaminated by what they'd done. Others followed, not all at once, but steadily, inevitably, like water draining from a vessel that had cracked beyond repair. Those who remained found they couldn't bear to look at each other. Conversations that had once flowed naturally now stopped mid-sentence. People crossed the street to avoid encounters. The church held services to empty pews. Ezekiel Napier, the man who'd led the council, who'd insisted on seeing the punishment through to its conclusion, hung himself in his barn on June 15, 1935. He left a note, "I was wrong. God forgive me. I was wrong about everything." Reverend Josiah Whitaker abandoned his pulpit in July. He walked away from the church he'd served for 23 years and was never seen in Stillwater Hollow again. A letter he sent to the Baptist Convention in Louisville was discovered in church archives in 1970. I can no longer claim to speak for God. I spoke for fear, for vengeance, for worst impulses of the human heart. My hands are stained, and no prayer can wash them clean. By September of 1935, fewer than 100 people remained in Stillwater Hollow. The general store closed, the school shut down, the church doors were locked. But the final blow, the event that truly erased Stillwater Hollow from existence, came in March of 1936, nearly a year after Thomas Brennan's death. A young man named David Strong, son of William Strong, who'd served as a guard during the breathing grave ordeal, was found dead in the woods. Suicide officially, but the circumstances were strange. He'd been found in the exact clearing where Brennan had been buried, and he'd carved words into the earth with a stick before taking his life. He was innocent. I know who did I cannot live with the knowing. David Strong was 19 years old. He'd been 14 when Rebecca Coulter disappeared, 16 when Emma Hensley was attacked. And according to a diary discovered after his death, he'd witnessed something in the winter of 1935 that he'd been too afraid to report. He'd seen his uncle, Marcus Bowman, one of the men who'd served as a guard at the breathing grave, emerge from the woods on the day Rebecca Coulter vanished, carrying something wrapped in a blanket. He'd seen Marcus Bowman with a bottle of chloroform months before it was discovered in Brennan's cabin. He'd heard his uncle and several other men discussing how to handle the stranger problem, before the council had even convened. The implication was clear, horrifying, and impossible to prove. Thomas Brennan had been innocent. The evidence against him had been planted. The real predator, or predators, had allowed an innocent man to be tortured and killed in order to protect themselves. When David Strong's diary was shared with the remaining community members, something snapped. The guilt that people had been carrying transformed into rage, then into despair, then into a collective decision that Stillwater Hollow needed to cease existing. Because if they'd killed an innocent man, if they'd tortured him for 7 days based on manufactured evidence, if their certainty had been not just wrong but deliberately manipulated, then the community itself was irredeemable. In April of 1936, the remaining residents held a final meeting. No minutes were kept, but the decision was unanimous. Stillwater Hollow would be abandoned. Everyone would leave. The town would be allowed to return to forest, and no one would ever speak of what had happened there. The phrase painted on every door, "God forgive what we became," appeared overnight on April 1st, 1936. No one claimed responsibility for painting it, but everyone understood its meaning. By May of 1936, Stillwater Hollow was empty. The last photograph of the settlement, taken by a traveling photographer who stumbled across the abandoned town in June of 1936, shows empty buildings, overgrown streets, and that terrible phrase repeated on every visible surface. The photographer asked questions in Jackson about what had happened. He was told, politely but firmly, that Stillwater Hollow had never existed. There was no such place. He must be mistaken. When he persisted, when he tried to find official records, he found nothing. Census documents had been removed. Maps had been altered. It was as if the entire community had been retroactively erased from history. And in a sense, it had been. The survivors had scattered across Kentucky and beyond, carrying with them the agreement to never speak the town's name, never acknowledge its existence, never reveal what had happened in those dark mountains. But secrets have weight. They fester. They pass through bloodlines like genetic disease. The story of Stillwater Hollow might have remained buried forever if not for a researcher named Dr. Elizabeth Hammond, a historian specializing in Appalachian communities, who stumbled across a reference to the settlement in a 1920 census document that had somehow escaped destruction. This was in 2003. Dr. Hammond spent 5 years tracking down descendants of Stillwater Hollow residents, convincing them to break their family's silence, assembling fragments of truth from people who'd spent their entire lives trying to forget. What she discovered was horrifying not just in its specifics, but in its universality. The people of Stillwater Hollow weren't monsters. They were ordinary people, farmers, storekeepers, teachers, parents who'd made terrible decisions based on fear, on certainty, on the conviction that they were protecting innocence. They'd believed they were righteous. They'd believed they were following God's will. They'd believed the stranger in their midst was a predator who needed to be stopped by any means necessary. And they'd been wrong. Thomas Brennan, according to documents Dr. Hammond eventually unearthed, had been exactly who he claimed to be: a drifter, a laborer, a man with no criminal history who'd been looking for work and a fresh start. The chloroform found in his cabin had indeed been planted, part of a conspiracy by several men who'd had their own reasons for wanting a scapegoat. Marcus Bowman, the man David Strong had implicated in his final diary entry, had died in 1947. But before his death, he'd made a confession to a priest, a confession that was sealed for 60 years, but was finally opened in 2007. In it, Bowman admitted to killing Rebecca Coulter, not intentionally, he claimed, an accident during an assault that had gone too far. He'd panicked, hidden the body, then realized he needed to redirect suspicion away from himself. Thomas Brennan had been convenient. A stranger, an outsider, easy to suspect, easy to condemn. Emma Hensley's attacker was never definitively identified, but evidence suggests it may have been Bowman as well, or one of his co-conspirators. men who'd seen the success of framing Brennan, Rebecca's death, and decided to use the same stranger as a scapegoat again. The breathing grave had been their masterpiece. Because once Brennan was buried alive, once the community was complicit in his torture and death, no one would question his guilt. To question his guilt would mean questioning their own righteousness, and that was psychologically impossible for most people to bear. But some couldn't bear it. Ezekiel Napier, Reverend Whittaker, Jacob Combs, David Strong. They'd been broken by the knowing, by the guilt, by the recognition that they'd participated in murdering an innocent man. And the community had been broken too, not immediately, not in a single moment, but slowly, inevitably, as the weight of what they'd done crushed them. Dr. Hammond's research was published in 2008 in a book titled The Hollow That Died of Shame: Memory, Guilt, and Collective Trauma in Appalachia. It received modest attention in academic circles, but was largely ignored by mainstream media. Perhaps that's fitting. Stillwater Hollow had tried to erase itself from history. Maybe history was simply respecting that choice. But the descendants remember. In interviews conducted by Dr. Hammond and subsequent researchers, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Stillwater Hollow residents spoke about growing up with a shadow they couldn't name, a family shame that was never explained but always present. My grandmother would wake up screaming sometimes. One descendant said she'd be screaming a name, Thomas, just Thomas, over and over, but she never told us who Thomas was or why his name haunted her. When she died, we found a letter she'd written but never sent. Addressed to someone named Brennan, it was just 2 words, "Forgive us." My grandfather had a rule. Another descendant reported. We were never allowed to mention justice or punishment or anything about someone getting what they deserved. He said those words were cursed. I didn't understand until after he died and I read about Stillwater Hollow. Then I understood. He'd watched justice turn into murder, and he could never forgive himself for not stopping it. The psychological term for what the residents of Stillwater Hollow experienced is collective moral injury, the trauma that results when a group violates its own deeply held moral standards. It's the kind of wound that doesn't heal, that passes through generations, that transforms into depression, substance abuse, fractured relationships, and suicide. The people of Stillwater Hollow had destroyed themselves more completely than any external force could have managed, because they'd destroyed their ability to see themselves as good. But here's what still haunts researchers, what keeps this story from being just another dark historical footnote. Who removed the breathing pipe on the night of May 6, 1935? Was it mercy or murder? Was it someone who couldn't bear to let Brennan suffer any longer, or someone who needed to ensure he died before he could be freed and potentially prove his innocence? Multiple people had access to the clearing that night. Marcus Bowman, who had every reason to want Brennan permanently silenced, was not on guard duty but could easily have made the journey unobserved. Members of the council who'd voted to end the punishment early might have removed the pipe as an act of compassionate killing. Or it could have been any of dozens of community members who were struggling with guilt and wanted to end Brennan's suffering. The question was investigated in 2005, using modern forensic techniques on documents and testimonies. No definitive answer was found. Perhaps that's the most disturbing aspect of all. Even in death, even in retrospect, even with all the truth finally revealed, the mystery persists. Someone in Stillwater Hollow committed murder that night. Someone made the decision to end Thomas Brennan's life, and everyone protected them, through silence, through collective amnesia, through the unspoken agreement that some questions are better left unanswered. Another question: Why did Marcus Bowman and his conspirators choose such an elaborate, cruel method to frame Brennan? Why not simply kill him and make it look like an accident? Researchers believe the breathing grave served multiple purposes. It satisfied the community's need for vengeance. It made Brennan's supposed guilt seem more certain. Surely the council wouldn't impose such severe punishment on an innocent man. And most cynically, it ensured that Brennan would be too traumatized, too broken, to effectively defend himself if he survived. But there's another, darker possibility. Maybe the cruelty was the point. Maybe men like Bowman, who'd committed unspeakable acts against children, needed to project their monstrousness onto someone else, needed to see themselves as righteous avengers rather than predators. The breathing grave allowed them to commit torture while calling it justice. And finally, how many other communities have similar secrets? Stillwater Hollow wasn't unique in its isolation, its poverty, its adherence to old ways. Throughout Appalachia, throughout rural America, there were thousands of such communities in the early 20th century. Small, isolated, governed by traditions that predated written law. How many of them had their own versions of the old remedy? How many collective traumas are buried in unmarked graves and sealed memories? How many families carry shame they can't name for acts they've tried to forget? We'll likely never know, because the lesson Stillwater Hollow teaches is that some communities would rather die than remember. Today, if you wanted to find Stillwater Hollow, you couldn't. The valley still exists between two mountains in Breathitt County that locals now call North Ridge and South Ridge, avoiding the old name. But the settlement itself has returned to forest. The buildings rotted and collapsed decades ago. The road grew over with grass and saplings. The creek still runs dark and slow through the valley, but it's called Clear Creek now, another name change, another attempt to distance present from past. But the land remembers. Hikers who stumble into the valley, and it's not easy to find, requiring navigation through dense forest without marked trails, report feeling uncomfortable. Wrong, as if the valley itself is hostile to human presence. They report finding stone foundations hidden under decades of leaf litter, rusted tools, broken pottery, and occasionally, if they look carefully, markers that might be graves. Small stone cairns, wooden crosses long since rotted, depressions in the earth that suggest something or someone was buried there long ago. In 2019, a team of archaeologists from the University of Kentucky attempted to conduct a formal survey of the Stillwater Hollow site. They managed 3 days before abandoning the project. The official reason given was budget constraints and difficult terrain. But interviews with team members suggest something else. They felt watched. They experienced equipment failures that couldn't be explained. And most disturbingly, they reported hearing sounds breathing. They said, coming from underground, from places where nothing living should exist. Rational explanation, wind through hollow logs, animals in burrows, the kind of auditory pareidolia that happens when humans are primed to expect something disturbing. But the researchers left, and the valley remains largely unvisited, undocumented, unremembered. The descendants of Stillwater Hollow, scattered across the country, have their own ways of remembering. Some families hold annual gatherings where they share stories, not about the town's destruction, but about its life before. The church dinners, the harvest celebrations, the normal, human moments before everything went wrong. Others refuse to acknowledge any connection to Stillwater Hollow at all. My grandmother came from Kentucky is as specific as they'll get. The name must never be spoken, the story must never be told, and some, a very few, have tried to atone. donations to child protection organizations, volunteer work with wrongly convicted prisoners, activism against capital punishment. Small gestures that can never balance the cosmic scales, but that represent attempts to transform inherited guilt into something productive. One descendant, speaking anonymously in 2015, said this: "I wasn't there, I didn't participate, but I carry it anyway, this knowledge that my ancestors were capable of such cruelty, such certainty that led them to torture an innocent man. It changes how you see yourself. I look at my children and wonder, is that capacity in them too, in me? If we were afraid enough, desperate enough, certain enough, would we become what they became? That question, would we become what they became, is the true legacy of Stillwater Hollow. We want to believe that what happened in Stillwater Hollow was an aberration. We want to believe that we've evolved beyond such darkness, that civilization has progressed, that the rule of law and human rights and basic decency would prevent such atrocity in modern times. But would they? Consider how quickly communities turn on outsiders when afraid. Consider how certainty, the absolute conviction that we're right and they're wrong, can override evidence, compassion, and basic humanity. Consider how easily we transform justice into vengeance when we believe ourselves threatened. The people of Stillwater Hollow weren't evil. They were afraid, they were desperate, they were convinced they were protecting their children. And in that fear, that desperation, that certainty, they committed an act so monstrous that it destroyed them. But the components that created that perfect storm of horror exist in every community, in every era, in every human heart. Fear, certainty, the need to protect our own, the willingness to sacrifice the outsider, the stranger, the one who doesn't belong. We've seen it throughout history. We see it today in different forms, with different justifications. The mechanisms change, the rhetoric evolves, but the fundamental pattern remains. A community feels threatened. A scapegoat is identified. Certainty hardens into conviction, and good people do terrible things because they believe, absolutely, that they're doing the right thing. Thomas Brennan died in absolute darkness, buried alive, innocent of the crimes he was punished for. His final words, heard by guards through a breathing pipe, were, "I forgive you." But forgiveness doesn't erase consequence. It doesn't resurrect the dead or heal the trauma. It doesn't restore the community that destroyed itself in a misguided attempt to protect innocence. The breathing grave destroyed everyone it touched, the man inside it, the men who dug it, the community that sanctioned it, even the descendants who inherited its shame. And somewhere in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, in a valley that appears on no maps, where the forest has reclaimed what civilization briefly occupied, the earth holds its secrets close. On certain nights, according to those few who still visit, according to local legends that persist despite efforts to forget, you can hear breathing. Slow, shallow, impossible breathing coming from underground. The sound of a man who died, but whose suffering echoes still through soil and stone and memory. Most dismiss it as wind, as imagination, as the mind's tendency to find pattern in random noise. But some know better, because the most terrifying stories are never really about the past. They're about what the past reveals about us, about our capacity for cruelty, our dangerous certainty, our willingness to commit atrocity when we believe we're righteous. And that capacity doesn't disappear with time. It doesn't fade with progress. It just waits, patient and hungry, for the right combination of fear and certainty to awaken it again. If this journey into one of America's darkest forgotten chapters has resonated with you, if you find yourself lying awake tonight pondering how easily good intentions transform into monstrous acts, then this channel has more uncomfortable truths waiting in the shadows. Subscribe if you're willing to confront the questions about human nature that history tries to bury. Leave a like if this account provoked something deeper than entertainment, if it made you question where the line is between justice and vengeance, between community protection and collective madness. And in the comments, I want to know this. If you'd been in Stillwater Hollow in 1935 with the fear thick enough to taste, with children threatened and a stranger in your midst, the entire community looking to you to help protect the innocent, would you have stood with the town? Would you have stood against them? Or, like most of us would if we're honest, would you have simply looked away and let others decide, making you complicit through silence? There's no right answer to that question, only honest ones, and sometimes honesty is the most terrifying thing of all. Until next time, remember, the most frightening stories aren't the ones about monsters hiding in darkness. They're the ones about ordinary people who become monstrous when they're absolutely certain they're right. Because that's a mirror we can't look away from. That's a darkness that lives in all of us, waiting for fear and certainty to give it permission to emerge. And the only protection we have against becoming what Stillwater Hollow became is remembering that certainty itself is dangerous, that outsiders are human, that fear is a terrible counselor, and that the question, what if we're wrong, is the most important question we can ask, especially when we're most certain we're right.